This is Land of Havilah, 2 Chronicles 18. At the same time Jehoshaphat was king of Judah, Ahab and his wife Jezebel were ruling Israel. They were worshiping idols, and Elijah was opposing them. 1 Kings devotes 7 chapters to that, but since the Chronicles are Judah-centric, there's no mention of it until here in chapter 18, where we get only a glimpse of Ahab and how his life ended. And we only get that much because Jehoshaphat, king of Judah, was part of that story. Verse 1. Now Jehoshaphat had riches and honor in abundance, and he allied himself with Ahab. Comment: in the 4 generations since Israel and Judah split, their kings have naturally been enemies. Now Jehoshaphat's allied himself with Ahab. It's striking because Jehoshaphat's a member of the house of David, he's been pursuing Yahweh, and Ahab and all his forerunners have been the opposite, pursuing idolatry. Maybe Jehoshaphat thought he could reform Ahab by making friends with him. Alliance in verse 1 is Hebrew kathan, which is a marriage alliance. Specifically, they arranged a marriage between Jehoshaphat's son and Ahab's sister, 2 Kings 8:26. That couple's history is coming later because the son will succeed Jehoshaphat, and his evil wife will try to take over the kingdom. Eventually, Yahweh will disentangle the situation and redeem Judah from it, but in the meantime, there's trouble brewing because of this mistake on the part of Jehoshaphat. Now, speaking of Jehoshaphat after he made the alliance, verse 2. After some years he went down to Ahab to Samaria. Ahab killed sheep and cattle for him in abundance and for the people who were with him, and moved him to go up with him to Ramoth Gilead. Comment: it says Jehoshaphat went down, but since it was north, we would say he went up. He went up to Samaria to visit his new friend and extended family member Ahab. In verse 2, Ahab honored Jehoshaphat and his entourage with a big state dinner, but now the trouble's starting because Ahab wants Jehoshaphat to help him conquer Ramoth Gilead, which is on the other side of the Jordan River. That area used to belong to Israel, but now the king of Syria has it. Verse 3. Ahab, king of Israel, said to Jehoshaphat, king of Judah, "Will you go with me to Ramoth Gilead?" He answered him, "I am as you are, and my people as your people. We'll be with you in the war." Jehoshaphat said to the king of Israel, "Please inquire first for Yahweh's word." Comment: in verses 3 and 4, Jehoshaphat fully committed himself to the war with one proviso, quote, "Please inquire first for Yahweh's word." It was almost a perfect answer because if Yahweh says yes, of course he should do it. But there was one very big error that Jehoshaphat should have asked Yahweh himself instead of telling Ahab to ask. Now Ahab will inquire from the false prophets of Yahweh that he's gathered around himself. Verse 5. Then the king of Israel gathered the prophets together, 400 men, and said to them, "Shall we go to Ramoth Gilead to battle, or shall I forbear?" They said, "Go up, for God will deliver it into the hand of the king." Comment: coming up, Jehoshaphat's not convinced that the 400 prophets are legit when they say go up. So he says, verse 6, "But Jehoshaphat said, Isn't there here a prophet of Yahweh besides that we may inquire of him?" Comment: in other words, I think we need to get a second opinion from a real prophet of Yahweh. Verse 7, the king of Israel said to Jehoshaphat, "There is yet one man by whom we may inquire of Yahweh, but I hate him, for he never prophesies good concerning me, but always evil. He's Micaiah the son of Imlah." Jehoshaphat said, "Don't let the king say so." Then the king of Israel called an officer and said, "Get Micaiah the son of Imlah quickly." Now the king of Israel and Jehoshaphat the king of Judah each sat on his throne, arrayed in their robes, and they were sitting in an open place at the entrance of the gate of Samaria, and all the prophets were prophesying before them. Coming up, one of the 400 false prophets of Yahweh will speak. Verse 10. Zedekiah the son of Chenaanah made himself horns of iron and said, "Yahweh says, with these you shall push the Syrians until they are consumed." All the prophets prophesied so, saying, "Go up to Ramoth Gilead and prosper, for Yahweh will deliver it into the hand of the king." Comment: Zedekiah tells Ahab, "You'll be like a bull with horns. You'll push the Syrians out and consume them." Now concerning the true prophet of Yahweh that Ahab doesn't like, the messenger who went to get him has found him and will try to put words in his mouth. Verse 12. The messenger who went to call Micaiah spoke to him, saying, "Behold, the words of the prophets declare good to the king with one mouth. Let your word, therefore, please be like one of theirs and speak good." Micaiah said, As Yahweh lives, I'll say what my God says. Comment, Micaiah says, I'm not here to be pleasant. I'll stick to what Yahweh tells me. We might imagine here that the 400 prophets who speak pleasingly are on the king's payroll and living well, because we know Jezebel supported hundreds of false prophets, 1 Kings 18:19. And this Micaiah that the king hates is probably just scraping by, because we know true prophets in Israel had to hide in caves and lacked food, 1 Kings 18:13. Yet Micaiah says, I'll stick to whatever Yahweh tells me. It's impressive that Micaiah is not in hiding. Even Elijah is in hiding right now. Coming up, the entire interchange between Micaiah, Ahab, and the false prophet wearing the horns, Zedekiah. Verse 14. When he had come to the king said to him, Micaiah, shall we go up to Ramoth-Gilead to battle, or shall I forbear? He said, Go up and prosper. They shall be delivered into your hand. The king said to him, How many times shall I adjure you that you speak to me nothing but the truth in Yahweh's name? He said, I saw all Israel scattered on the mountains, as sheep that have no shepherd. Yahweh said, These have no master. Let them each return to his house in peace. The king of Israel said to Jehoshaphat, Didn't I tell you that he would not prophesy good concerning me, but evil? Micaiah said, Therefore hear Yahweh's word. I saw Yahweh sitting on his throne, and all the army of heaven standing on his right hand and on his left. Yahweh said, Who will entice Ahab, king of Israel, that he may go up and fall at Ramoth-Gilead? One spoke, saying in this way, and another saying in that way. A spirit came out, stood before Yahweh, and said, I'll entice him. Yahweh said to him, How? He said, I'll go and will be a lying spirit in the mouth of all his prophets. He said, You will entice him, and will prevail also. Go and do so. Now therefore, behold, Yahweh's put a lying spirit in the mouth of these your prophets, and Yahweh has spoken evil concerning you. Then Zedekiah the son of Chenaanah came near, and struck Micaiah on the cheek, and said, Which way did Yahweh's spirit go from me to speak to you? Micaiah said, Behold, you shall see on that day when you go into an inner room to hide yourself. The king of Israel said, Take Micaiah and carry him back to Amnon, the governor of the city, and to Joash, the king's son, and say, Thus says the king, Put this fellow in the prison, and feed him with bread of affliction and with water of affliction, until I return in peace. Micaiah said, If you return at all in peace, Yahweh's not spoken by me. He said, Listen, you people, all of you. Comment, in verse 14, Micaiah prophesied that Ahab would be successful at Ramoth-Gilead, which wasn't true. Nevertheless, Yahweh was true to Ahab, because in verse 15 he allowed Ahab to see right through Micaiah. Quote, How many times shall I adjure you that you speak to me nothing but the truth in Yahweh's name? End quote. Micaiah gave him the truth in verse 16, that his army would be scattered like sheep with no shepherd. In verse 17, Ahab told Jehoshaphat, Didn't I tell you? He knew all along what the word of Yahweh would be, but he's in the habit of rejecting it. In verses 18 to 22, Micaiah explained what happened in heaven, that Yahweh sent a lying spirit to the 400 prophets. But as we just said, though the prophets were false, Yahweh didn't withhold the truth from Ahab. He knew the truth all along. In verse 23, the prophet with the ridiculous horns struck Micaiah, and Micaiah answered him, You'll have plenty of time to contemplate how right I was and how wrong you were when you're in hiding, meaning you're about to lose the king who protects you and you'll have to hide. In verses 25 and 26, Micaiah will go to prison with bread and water only, but soon the king who ordered it will be dead. In verse 27, while they were dragging Micaiah away, he kept prophesying. He said, If you return in peace, Yahweh's not spoken by me. End quote. And he told all the people to listen. So will Jehoshaphat help Ahab at Ramoth-Gilead or not? Verse 28. So the king of Israel and Jehoshaphat, the king of Judah, went up to Ramoth-Gilead. The king of Israel said to Jehoshaphat, I'll disguise myself and go into the battle, but you put on your robes. So the king of Israel disguised himself, and they went into the battle. Comment, Ahab will dress in disguise on the battlefield, and Jehoshaphat will dress like Ahab. This will make him Ahab's decoy. He's trusting Ahab and not Yahweh. Let's not give ourselves over to the counsel of the wicked. Quote, Blessed is the man who doesn't walk in the counsel of the wicked, Psalm 1:1. Now changing scenes to the opposing forces of Syria, verse 30. Now the king of Syria had commanded the captains of his chariots, saying, "Don't fight with small nor great, except only with the king of Israel." Comment, the Syrian chariots will be going straight for Jehoshaphat, thinking he's Ahab. Verse 31. When the captains of the chariots saw Jehoshaphat, they said, "It's the king of Israel." Therefore they turned around to fight against him. But Jehoshaphat cried out, and Yahweh helped him, and God moved them to depart from him. When the captains of the chariots saw that it was not the king of Israel, they turned back from pursuing him. Comment, now Ahab will get his. Verse 33. A certain man drew his bow at random and struck the king of Israel between the joints of the armor. Therefore he said to the driver of the chariot, "Turn your hand and carry me out of the army, for I am severely wounded." The battle increased that day. However, the king of Israel propped himself up in his chariot against the Syrians until evening, and at about sunset he died. Comment, in verse 32, Yahweh gave the charioteers recognition of Jehoshaphat, and they turned away. It was because of Jehoshaphat's eloquent prayer in verse 31. Actually, he didn't pray at all. He just cried out, and Yahweh heard him. Quote, "The righteous cry, and Yahweh hears and delivers them out of all their troubles." Psalm 34:17. If we have time to scream, it's not too late. In verses 33 and 34, what seemed like a random arrow struck Ahab between the joints of his armor. But we know things aren't what they seem. Ahab instructed his driver to exit the battle so he could watch from the rear. He propped himself up in his chariot, bled into the floor of it, 1 Kings 22:35, and died about sunset. 2 Chronicles 19 is next at landofhavilah.net.